Since the start of the coronavirus pandemic, Mr. Trump has downplayed the severity of the problem.
Woodrow Wilson tried to minimize the Spanish flu epidemic.
Pretended it wasn't happening.
Despite public warnings against mass gatherings, President Trump is encouraging thousands of people to gather for a fireworks display.
Woodrow Wilson encouraged public events. He told mayors and governors to have military parades.
The year 1918. In the fall of 1918, the United States was approaching a midterm election like none other before. Not only were President Woodrow Wilson and his fellow Democrats trying to keep control of Congress during the home stretch of World War I, they were trying to do so in the middle of one of the deadliest pandemics in world history, the Spanish flu.
This is a flu. This is like a flu.
The first wave of the so-called Spanish flu had begun that spring when the first official cases were reported at Camp Funston, a U.S. Army training camp at Fort Riley, Kansas. The second wave, which emerged in September 1918 at an Army training camp and naval facility near Boston, will be far worse. This time, the flu spread quickly into the civilian population of Boston and other cities of the East Coast. In the month of October alone, a total of 195,000 Americans died. As scientists raced to find a vaccine, public health officials turned to time-tested methods of social distancing and quarantine. State and local officials around the country banned public gatherings, closing schools, churches, theaters, bars, and other spots where people typically met in groups.
Only essential businesses will be functioning.
I told her she should stay back 6 feet. I'm not the one. Wear a mask, spreading germs all around.
Donald Trump is pushing the debunked conspiracy that coronavirus was man-made in a lab in Wuhan, China.
People began blaming the Germans, claiming they were spreading poison clouds or that Bayer, which was a German-owned company, had infected their
Due to these widespread bans, many candidates in the 1918 midterms could not campaign in a typical way. Barred in many cases from holding rallies or speaking events, they were forced to rely on less direct forms of communication, including seeking out newspaper coverage or sending campaign literature through the mail. Some candidates even accused public health officials of trying to influence the election by limiting the turnout. Patriotism aside, only around 40% of eligible U.S. voters cast their ballots on November 5th, 1918, compared with 50% in the previous midterm election. Republicans won control of both the House and the Senate for the first time since 1908, marking a major defeat for Wilson and his foreign policy agenda. The election's low turnout can't be entirely blamed on the flu. Around 2 million men were fighting in the war at the time, representing a high percentage of the U.S. voting population. American women wouldn't get the right to vote until 1920. Yet, even if the flu war only partially explains the voting drop-off, it undoubtedly had an impact.
We're averaging now around 200,000 to 300,000 infections a day, about 3,000 to 4,000 deaths per day. I mean, you have to look at those numbers and say, we've got to do something different.
The president suggested Americans can inject themselves with disinfectants to ward off COVID-19.
The disinfectant, it knocks it out in a minute.
Snake oil salesman had a field day. Vicks VapoRub also advertised itself as a remedy for the flu, claiming to stimulate the mucous membrane to throw off the germs.
When the 1918 influenza epidemic began its deadly tour across the United States, African Americans were already beset by a host of major public health, medical, and social problems that shaped how they experienced the epidemic and how the epidemic affected them.
This crisis is magnifying cracks that have long existed in our healthcare system.
By 1918, medical and public health records had documented that African Americans suffered higher morbidity and mortality rates than white people for several diseases. The Atlanta Board of Health, for example, reported in 1900 that the black death rate exceeded that of the white death rate by 69%. In an analysis of the 1900 census, W.E.B. Du Bois, the influential sociologist and civil rights activist, found that African American death rates were 2 to 3 times higher than that for white people for several diseases, including tuberculosis, pneumonia, and diarrhea disease. Although African Americans had low rates for scarlet fever, cancer, and liver disease, Du Bois concluded, quote, "The Negro death rate is, however, undoubtedly considerably higher than the white," end quote.
I'm not the one. Wear masks, spreading germs all around.
1919 was a period of great anxiety. The economy was topsy-turvy, inflation was out of control, and there was an enormous amount of strikes. World War I was coming to an end, and black and white soldiers were returning home from war. African Americans were also leaving the South and moving to northern cities. Southern African American sharecroppers were actually making money because there was a worldwide demand for cotton. Everyone needed cotton after the war. African American social uplift sparked tensions among Southern and Northern whites. These tensions resulted in what is called the Red Summer. As a result, racial riots took place in over 36 cities in America. The fourth and final wave of the Spanish flu happened around the summer of 1920. This final wave caused widespread panic, but it was short-lived, and the world and the United States was ready for a comeback.
And, of course, after the Spanish flu, we have the Roaring Twenties. Avant-garde cinema, great leaps forward in music, literature, aviation, and art. Though brief and often overshadowed by the Great Depression of the 1930s and the Second World War which followed, this was a new era of prosperity, of social mobility, and change.